What can we learn from studying political theory, and how can we use wit and humor to persuade people, but also to save our society from the march towards the woke tyranny? I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're watching this video on YouTube right now, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to True North, make sure you hit the notification bell so that you get notifications and you never miss any of our videos. If you're watching on Facebook, make sure you like True North, leave us a comment, and share any ideas that you have for the show. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Finally, if you're listening to this podcast over on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you enjoy your podcasts, don't forget to subscribe to The Candice Malcolm Show. And if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star review. Okay, so sometimes when you're watching the news, and this happens to me so often, I'll see a headline on the CBC or I'll read a report, and sometimes it's just so absurd, so ridiculous, so offensive, you don't know whether you should laugh or you should cry. Well, my guest on the show today says that you should laugh, and that when we look to political teachings, when we look to the ancient Greeks, people like Aristotle and Plato, when we look at the New Testament, when we look to philosophers and writers like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Hobbes, Mark Twain, or even modern day comics like Norm Macdonald or Jon Stewart, they all use humor and wit as a helpful tool to navigate the world, to warn us on the dangers of tyranny, and to persuade an audience. So my guest today on the podcast is Travis Smith. Smith is a professor of political theory at Concordia University in Montreal. He completed his master's and doctorate in political theory at Harvard University, and he was recently a guest on my show. Now, while I was preparing for the show, while I was prepping for the interview, I came across an amusing essay that Travis wrote called Thomas Hobbes Comedian. And I really enjoyed it. When I reached out to him to ask him about it, he sent me another essay that he wrote called An Introduction to the Politics of Wit, a Symposium, which was also a great read. And so I've invited Travis back on the show to do another deep dive into political theory. So Travis, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to the show.
I'm really glad to be here today. Thanks for having me on the show today, Candice.
Okay, so let's talk about comedy. Let's talk about the use of comedy in writing about politics and thinking about politics. Can you first tell me about these essays and just basically the idea of wit as a political virtue?
Right. So whether or not there's any sort of humor in our politics is maybe a sign of its health, right? When politics becomes absolutely humorless, we know that things have gone horribly wrong. And tyrants in particular are renowned for lacking a sense of humor. So when we see parliamentarians, getting their jabs in, when we see, op-eds written with some wit, when we have, media personalities and comedians who are able to sort of help us not only stick it to the people we disagree with, but also help us, understand things a little bit better, make us think twice about things. Those are all signs that things are going a little bit better for our polity. And when things become too dour or too angry, it's a sure sign that something is really amiss.
Well, and we see that, I would say, especially in the last 10 years or so, the rise of the sort of nighttime comedy, it was really big and powerful, say, in the era of George Bush when he was president. Then Barack Obama came around, and I feel like comics had a tougher time with him. They didn't really know how to make fun of him, and part of it was because so many comedians are on the political left, and they saw Obama as an ally. They see Justin Trudeau as an ally. So you don't see them poking fun as much. And the same thing can be said about Joe Biden today. We still see so much of the political humor being aimed at the right. So when you had Trump come along, in some ways it was easy for them, but in some ways it was also, the bar was so low that you just saw so many comics kind of going out of their way to bash Trump that it wasn't funny. It was like watching amateur pundits that didn't really know what they were talking about. So is it possible sometimes that humor can be used the opposite way, and it can undermine political discourse?
Sure, right. Well, I mean, with President Obama, there were humorous things about him. Some comedians got really good at doing impressions of his very peculiar cadence. You're right. The previous president was a target of a great deal of comedic attack or late night comedy sketches and bits. there is a lot of memeing going on about the current president as well. But right, during the past little while, what I tend to think really was the sort of the downfall of a lot of this was the Jon Stewart style of comedy, in which almost every Jon Stewart joke for years had the same punchline. And the punchline was some version of, can you believe these guys? Or what a bunch of idiots? Or look how stupid they are, with always being the sort of, think about how smart we are, being the joke, night in, night out, nonstop. And it's tiresome, and it's cheap. It's easy stuff. And that became the mode of that kind of comedy. Now, a lot of late night comedy is also what they call punching down of that kind, right? We have contempt for the people that you are making fun of. And you're just, as I said, trying to show how stupid they are, how bad they are. And, you know, when you look at a classical conception of the role of wit in politics, there's an understanding that there's something very unseemly, you know, very base, vulgar about just punching down, you know, taking the targets that you think are contemptible and just showing how contemptible they are. And so it's a sign of, again, the health of things when you have a kind of respect for the people that you are also poking fun at. Right. I mean, on the other hand, punching up can also be something that you need to do when you have, you know, something that's gone horribly awry and you've got people who are behaving oppressively, when the wit can be used in order to try to take down the very powerful, when you have almost no other weapons. When you have almost no other weapons, sometimes humor is the thing that you can make recourse to, especially in order to get people to realize that things need to be called into question.
Well, and so reading some of your essays on the use of comedy and wit throughout sort of some of the classic political theorists and contemporary political theorists, a lot of it seems to be aimed at sort of the aristocracy or the religious leaders, like for instance with Benjamin Franklin, that he poked fun at the ideas around religion, not because he wanted to abolish religion, but sort of because he wanted to save it. So can you walk us through a little bit, either of the classics or the more contemporary thinkers, some of the best uses of comedy to help persuade an audience or prove a point?
Right. Well, that's sort of what I was saying before about when the people make fun of those in power. Sometimes that's the only sort of weapons they might have, but also it can be effective for piercing their conceits and exposing to people that they aren't quite as smart or as virtuous or as righteous or as pious as they pretend to, and therefore you might use wit in order to call their legitimacy into question. And so, right, in early modern times, when the democratic revolution was really getting underway, a thinker like Thomas Hobbes had lots of fun pointing out how ridiculous aspects of the regime of the aristocrats or the rule of the church had been. And so that was an important sort of weapon in his philosophical arsenal. Hobbes is famous for claiming that he's just offering, you know, a purely scientific mode of thinking, purely rational, purely materialistic. But despite those claims, he is constantly using literary devices, rhetorical devices, especially wit, in order to communicate and persuade people of the claims that he's making, the accusations and the criticisms that he's offering. And wit is something that, is one of the things that Aristotle in classical political science recognizes one of the highest social virtues. He puts it in his list of virtues just before justice. So it's not higher than justice, right? Justice is still sort of the pinnacle of the political virtues, but it's the one he discusses right before justice to indicate how important it is. And my interpretation of that is he knows that because we don't ever actually live in a condition of perfect justice, and the natural reaction to injustice is anger, but excessive anger is itself a condition that's unlivable, that we need something to temper anger in order to render living in an imperfect world tolerable, right? And wit is one of the things that we have. in order to help us cope with, and also cope with injustice, but also help us fight for greater justice, especially in the face of abuses of power, in the face of people whose claims to expertise, wisdom, righteousness, so forth, are exaggerated and pretentious and deserving of ridicule.
Okay, let's take that sort of idea from Aristotle and try to apply it to today's political left, because some of the themes you were talking about, the sort of excessive anger, like sometimes the left will criticize something and you kind of say, okay, they have a point. You know, they found something that is unjust. They pointed out something about our society that can be true, but it's just that their solution to the problem is usually either completely changing the system and proposing something that's impossible, never been tried, or you just see their sort of righteous anger. You see it in the environmentalist movement, in the sort of woke left, and the quote unquote anti-racist movement, but also that aspect of humorlessness. Like they don't use humor. They cancel people for trying to use humor. Hence why comedians don't even bother to go to university campuses anymore. So I want you to try to help us understand what the left perhaps could learn from using more wit and humor, what they could learn from trying to pick up on what Aristotle was trying to teach.
Okay, I'm going to be sort of less ready to just accuse one side of the political spectrum of being guilty of this problem myself, Candice. But that said, let me say that, right, you mentioned something about designs for trying to transform all of society, as if we could, through sufficient reason, sufficient willpower, sufficient imagination, we might be able to impose ourselves upon the social system and re-engineer it and reconstruct it in accordance with what we know to be right and true. And we could fix everything and treat society and treat human beings as an engineering project. To be reconstructed, overhauled, recreated. And what it requires are, as I said, the very virtuous and the very wise to take charge and repair it. And this isn't something that I'm willing to sort of accuse any particular movement of being exclusively guilty of. This is something that dates back, a concern that dates back even to Plato's Republic. In which the idea of philosopher kings was first pitched as what would be necessary in order to achieve the just society, with an understanding that Plato knew that we actually could not do that. Any effort to try to manufacture the just society would be something that would not only be monstrous, but humorless. Plato's writings are full of humor, and he loves telling stories and using irony and jokes. And so, right, part of why there's a susceptibility to this in modern times, however, is that you've heard people talk about seeing modern times as a kind of secularization of Christian ethics or a Christian conception of history. And that put human beings in the role of imagining that we could save ourselves, that we could manufacture a heaven on earth. As I said, if only we had enough willpower, enough imagination, enough material means and powers at our disposal, and sufficient righteousness and wisdom in those in charge. And that's an attempt to imagine that we could use our reason to manufacture what is actually a comical outcome. Right? Comedies are always when there's a happy ending. Comedies are when, despite all appearances, things go well. And even people who are not really up to the task succeed, beyond belief. And people who might not even deserve great happiness all get it, right? And that's comedy. I'm a reader of comic books. I wrote a book on superheroes a few years ago, and comic books are rightly called comic books in some ways because the superheroes triumph over supervillains that try to take over the world and impose themselves on us all. Of course, the supervillains tend to often believe that they've got some very rational design. If only everybody did what I said that they should do, and I had all the power and I was in charge, and I imposed my will, then the world would know all the love and joy that only I can bring to it. As soon as somebody thinks like that, they're a madman. They're crazy. They're deserving of ridicule. And so we have a society that loves our heroes that defeat our supervillainous types, but in politics, we have this idea that maybe some great extraordinary leaders might be able to transform the world and abolish all the injustice, if only they had all the power and all the trust of the people. This idea that we can manufacture comedy through the imposition of technological reason is, however, from a classical point of view, prone to tragedy. That's not something that works out happily, like, the victories of superheroes in comic books. That's something that we could, the classics would tell us that we should fully expect to go entirely awry. And so, right, we've seen efforts of a great variety of kinds, especially over the last 100 years, in which people have believed that on account of their nobility, on account of their wisdom, on account of their piety, on account of their righteousness, on account of their virtue, they could fix the world. I ended that book I mentioned with a claim that global governance is for supervillains. Anybody who believes that they could fix the world in that way is somebody we should not trust and ridicule.
Well, I appreciate you answering the question that way, because you're right that the anger, the righteous anger, it doesn't just come from one side of the political spectrum. We do see it on both sides. It's just that to me particularly, the side that I'm concerned about right now is the left. But I agree that when you think of the world in terms of what the biggest threat is to us, the ideas you mentioned. I have a son, and he's reading a little Spider-Man kids comic book, and in it the bad guy is just named the evil doctor. And it's kind of weird, Travis, because in today's world we're told to trust doctors, that doctors are good, doctors are the authority that we should trust. And then yet interestingly in this, and it's an old Spider-Man book, it's probably from the 80s or something, it's the idea that the villain is an evil doctor, which I sometimes chuckle at when I see the latest news of some doctor imposing these ridiculous rules or advocating for endless lockdowns, and I kind of chuckle about the idea of an evil doctor. I want to change gears a little bit and just take a step back and talk about the purpose of political philosophy. I remember when I was a undergraduate at the University of Alberta, my first day walking into a political philosophy course or a history of political philosophy course, and my professor saying, why should we bother reading the Greeks? What could we possibly learn from a bunch of old white dead guys? And the point of the course was to show that there was some purpose in reading someone like Plato or Aristotle. This is what you do day in and day out, so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the relevance of reading political philosophy and what we can learn from that today.
Right. Maybe I can tell you about how I approach it when I'm teaching undergraduates. And so I started off as an engineering student, right? And so when you go into engineering classes as an undergraduate, you're going to be treated to calculus and organic chemistry and heat transfer and fluid dynamics and that sort of thing, where the professor is the expert. Back when I was there, they're still sort of throwing up endless blackboards for 75 minutes straight, in which matters regarding which there is to be reckoned no dispute are authoritatively put in front of you, and you are like a student, like a machine, to figure out how to add this knowledge to your toolkit to solve future problems. And you're measured on your ability to acquire certainty and exactness, precision, and the application of this kind of knowledge. And every student that's in an engineering classroom is someone you are training to be an engineer. Even if they don't end up being an engineer, end up working in sales for a technology firm, you still train everyone to be an engineer. That's not how you teach political theory. You don't look at a room of 100 students who've been put into your intro to political theory class because it's a requirement for their degree, as if they're all going to become professional political theorists. Even when I get one student who says, I'm thinking of going into political theory, can I get a letter of reference for a graduate school letter? Can I get a letter of reference? I'm like, why do you want to go into political theory? And they'll give me some answer. Often it's because, well, I want to spend my time reading and writing, right? I really love to read. And I like to say, well, if you really love to read, get a job as a night watchman or something. if that's what you really care about. The study of it from a professional standpoint is one thing, but what is it for as part of, citizen education? What is it the liberal education, human education? That's how I sort of tend to think of it. And part of it is when you are, fortunate enough, lucky enough, privileged enough to get to be in university, in the prime of your life, when your mental sort of abilities are at their prime, when you actually are still, capable of, thinking quickly and absorbing new ideas and still adapting to the world, exposing students to, ideas that are in some ways familiar but also different, and should get them to think a bit more broadly and gain some historical sense and get some theoretical breadth, so that you're not just caught in the politics of the day and the news cycle and the Twitterverse and the hashtagging and the us versus thems, and try to be able to sort of step back and try to perceive things from perspectives that are altogether foreign, not only to you maybe, but to the discourse that prevails today, and the back and forth between the parties that are preeminent presently, and to be able to sort of, reflect more on the human condition more broadly, and your place in society and your place in the world, and the status of the things that you care about and the things that you value. There's a real luxury to being able to do that. And so, unlike the sort of the training for an engineering career that undergraduates in that program are engaged in, and rightly so, I mean, that makes perfectly good sense. When you get to be in a course in which you're assigned old books to read, this is not to train you to solve a problem, right, or to fix anything, or to become the expert that will dictate to others what to do. But it's a human activity of just becoming more self-aware and thoughtful. And part of that is what I really like to emphasize in the classroom, because we don't do this in politics. We don't do this on the Twitterverse. We don't do this on YouTube even very often, which is learn how to, really give a generous reading to the people that we disagree with. Try to understand why they're coming from, where they're coming from, and abstract away from yourself a little bit, and to gain those kinds of skills. Now, of course, those kinds of skills can be practically useful, because you can always criticize something more convincingly if you do it from the inside, rather than just have a straw man that you attack and caricature and so forth. If you can really ridicule something, go back to saying about wit before, you can really ridicule something if you explode it from the inside on its own terms, rather than just lob grenades at it from the outside. And so there are practical benefits for an education in philosophy, rhetoric, literature, and so forth. But I guess I'm a bit old-fashioned in this way, that I think that politics is not actually the most important thing, and politics is not everything, and that we're human beings before we're citizens, and that we're neighbors before we are members of parties, and that there's an essential purpose to be filled by retaining, maintaining, communicating education in things like philosophy, literature, old books, that's humanizing and reminds us of that we're more than our party identity, and we're more than our commitments and our sides in one or another debate of the day. So that's part of how I look at it, Candice.
Well, that's excellent. I mean, there's so many things that I could pick up on there, but the idea that sort of politics in some ways has crept into every aspect of our lives, and this is more of a US phenomenon, but you see politics infused now in things like hockey. Hockey used to be something where you would go to escape politics and just go and enjoy something lightheartedly, and now it's like, we hear the woke hectoring throughout sports, entertainment, movies. It's sort of nonstop, and that's also part of a problem. And then the idea of social media, in some ways, it's an opportunity to use wit. You can reply to someone, you can say something funny, but at the same time, it's also set up for straw man arguments and really putting the worst possible spin on what your political opponent is saying. And for me, I've taken a little bit of a break from Twitter because, you could find yourself getting too deep into that. But my final question that I wanted to ask you, Travis, is so back to myself as an undergraduate reading political philosophy in Edmonton. I remember I was carrying a copy of Alan Bloom's Plato Republic, and a security guard in the building, not at the school, the apartment where I lived, he asked me what I was doing reading that. And the security guard was from India. He was a political philosophy teacher in India. He just moved to Canada and he was working as a security guard. And I said, I'm a political philosophy student, or actually just political science, and this is a requirement. And he was like, well, you're too young to be reading that book. You don't understand it. He's like, teachers should be assigning books about philosophy for you to read. You shouldn't be reading the original text yet. You can read that later. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And sometimes I did feel like I was reading it and it wasn't really computing. I wasn't really understanding what I was reading. But I appreciate it nonetheless. And I like reading about political philosophy as much as I like reading or trying to read political philosophy, although I'm pretty slow when it comes to reading philosophy. But all that is just to say, Travis, is there a book that you recommend someone who doesn't really have a background in this stuff? What's a good place to start? Who's a good thinker to start in a journey of trying to read and understand political philosophy?
Can I just ask, did you get to take a class on Plato with Leon Craig?
No, it wasn't Leon Craig. It was Heidi Studer.
Oh, I remember Heidi. What book do I recommend? You know what? Let's just go with ones that everybody used to read, even just in high school, and maybe they aren't anymore. If you haven't read Your Brave New World, read Your Brave New World right now in the late 2021. That's not a bad start. I'll go with that as something that everybody, if they haven't read it, they should read it. And if they have read it, they should reread it. Okay,
well, that sounds good. That's our required Christmas reading here on the Candice Malcolm Show, and Travis, will have to have you back in the new year, and you can talk. We can do a little book review on it.
Sure, that sounds great, Candice. Thank you very much for having me on the show today.
All right, thank you so much to Travis Smith for joining the show, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show.